So this short video will be about racism through the lens of vampires. Over the past few months, there has been a lot of social unrest following the deaths of three particularly African American people by the hands of police or former police officers. The focus right now is on Black Lives Matter, but it is important to realize that each racial group and each minority identity has individual details that allies dedicated to being anti-racist need to learn as they develop in their anti-racist efforts. I am a vampire scholar, and I have found a lot of useful metaphors as I've studied the trajectory of vampire literature, and that is what I would like to share today in my humble contribution to being anti-racist at Lycoming College. Unquestionably, the most important contribution to vampire literature was Dracula, which was published shortly before the year 1900, and in that story, there are a number of characters who contribute letters and diary entries, and it is only when these characters start putting their pieces of the story together that a more holistic story starts to emerge and they can solve the problem of Dracula. About a half a century later, Richard Matheson wrote the novella I Am Legend, and it is important to note that the novella is quite a bit different than any of the movies that came after it. What struck me in particular about this novella is that the main character is cooped up inside at night when the vampires are active, and he can only see the world through a tiny peephole. So his entire worldview for half of every day is a hole the size of a quarter. And because his view is so limited, he misses that a whole vampire society has risen up around him, and he comes to realize that he is the monster more so than they are. And what is important about this is, in reality, all of us live looking at the world through our own private peephole. Our perspective is extremely limited to our own experiences and the stories we choose to engage in. About 20 years after I Am Legend, Anne Rice wrote Interview with the Vampire, and while these vampires are still monsters, the entire story changes when the story is told from their perspective. Vampire literature explores our fears of what is different, and this is highly relevant to the issue of racism. Our entire world is based on stories. Everything that we understand about how we got where we are today is stories. And who has told us the stories that we have absorbed? Our textbooks that tell us the history of our world and our country really are the history of white men. And there are other stories available out there if we choose to go find them. So I very much believe that vampires are real, and racism is an extremely powerful and terrifying form of vampirism. Ignoring or taking advantage of privilege is a very real-world example of how some of us can have a half-life through sucking the life out of others. And this vampirism happens at both an individual and a systemic level. About a year ago, I went to a conference, and one of the keynote speakers was Michelle Norris, who has been a longtime reporter for National Public Radio and is the head of the Race Card Project, which asks people to send in postcards that describe their race story in 6 words or less. I found this challenge intriguing and went back to my hotel room and thought about what would my 6-word race story be. And pretty quickly I came up with, I don't want to be a vampire. I don't want to live in this world by sucking the life out of others or exhausting others by how I choose to exist. To step away from the metaphor of vampires, I'd like to start wrapping this up with 3 powerful quotes by 3 very famous activists. Elie Wiesel says, "We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim." Desmond Tutu says, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor." And Martin Luther King Jr. said, "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than justice." All 3 of these quotes stress that taking advantage of one's privilege, whether it's racial privilege or something else, is inherently oppressive. Standing against racism is extraordinarily complex. There are no step-by-step directions. It is not possible to be simply not racist because we grew up in a very racist society. It is not possible to be woke in a sense that once awakened, you're good, that you don't need to keep growing. Instead, is a daily commitment to being anti-racist. It is a daily commitment to being uncomfortable. It is a daily commitment to taking responsibility for one's mistakes. It is a daily commitment to openly seeking out the perspectives of those who are different from us. Although we have to be careful of not traumatizing or exhausting those around us by asking basic questions that we could find elsewhere. Instead, we should start by looking at those who have been willing to share their stories in writing, in books and articles and movies. But we should be also listening to the feedback that people give us face to face. And finally, although this is not a comprehensive list, being anti-racist is a daily commitment to really trying to not exist in the world at the expense of others. So I hope that looking at this very brief introduction to racism through the lens of vampires is helpful. And I hope that each of us who truly wishes to be an ally will make a daily commitment to not being a vampire. Thank you for watching this video.